Hello there. This is going to be a simple guide on how to set up RomM or ROM Manager or ROM. I think it's pronounced. I'm not sure which one. I'm going to call it ROM just for ease. The reason I say a simple guide is because if you're new to self-hosting or new to using things like network storage or running things like Docker, then you might find this tutorial a bit overwhelming. This is not a tutorial for beginners. So I will make this guide as simple as I can so you can follow along. However, you may struggle at points. If you do, feel free to pop a question in the comments, or you can join my Discord and ask me directly. But don't get overwhelmed, but it is overwhelming. So that's a bit of a redundant thing to say. So, firstly, let's have a look at what ROM actually is. So, what is ROM? So, ROM is a self hosted ROM library manager. You can use it to display all your ROMs in a nice library. You can even play them over the internet. So, if you're pretending to do some work or you're traveling, whatever it might be, you can still access your ROM library remotely on your home machine. The way I use it is I have devices such as the AYN Thor, and I've recently done another factory reset of my AYN Odin here. So what I'm going to do is rather than have a load of games or plug a USB thing or use FTP and transfer all my games over wirelessly, and it's a bit kind of a nightmare because you're just looking at text names. What ROM does is it gives you, like is here in the screenshot, this nice big library that you can view. So if we just click View Demo here, we get a nice little kind of dummy installation that they've set up for us. So this is basically what it's like. So we've got our platforms down here. So if you say, oh, I want to look at my NES games, you've got them here, like a nice kind of Netflix type of library. So you can easily see what you'd want. And then if you want to, oh, I want to download D-Pad Hero 2, we can just download that and that will download that to my device. In this case, I'm on my PC. Obviously, there are many apps. For example, there is Argosy Launcher, which I'll be covering at the end of the video or towards the end of the video. There is also Grout, which I'll also be covering, which is available on some Anvenic devices. The Trim UI devices are well on some custom firmwares, but we'll get into that as we see fit. Is that Hitler with a Karen haircut? So one feature of ROM is we also have this lovely big screen. So you could, for example, hook up a mini PC to a TV and you could have it as like a little kind of emulation console for your living room, for example. So it's very easy to navigate. It's very simple. Unfortunately, the setup is a little bit more involved. Someone has made a Pringles game. I'm going to have to try some of these games at some point because I'm very intrigued. So that is just a brief overview of what ROM does. I'll showcase more of the features when we set up our own installation. So, like I said earlier, I'll be installing this onto my network drive, which I'll access through my browser. You can install this locally on your Windows machine. Either way, the process guide will be pretty much the same. But like I said, any questions, never hesitate to ask. Can be quite a complicated process for newcomers. Okay, so the first thing we want to need to download is Docker. Now, I'm not going to technically do this step because I already have Docker installed on my server, but all you need to do is download Docker Desktop. It's available for both Mac chips, both sets of Windows chips, and Linux as well. So for those ones, just install them the same as you would any other app on that operating system. Now, what is Docker? Docker is a way for you imagine you want to have something to eat. You can go to the shop, you can buy your ingredients, you need the tools to cook it, the oven, the grill, the microwave, whatever it is, you need all these different components. What Docker's like ordering a takeaway or takeout meal. It arrives, it's done. You've got one bag with all the food in it ready to go. That's a bit of a tortured analogy, but in a nutshell, that's kind of what it is. So get that downloaded, installed, and then I will flip over to my server and we'll go from there. So in order to actually install ROM, we're going to need a few things. The main one, if we go over to rom.app and we go to install now, we go on the left-hand side here, or that link there, we can go onto the quick start guide inside the getting started tab. So this will basically tell you what your prerequisites are. So Docker installed and running on your system, obviously, which I already have, and then hopefully by this point in the video you have as well. Your ROMs organized in the correct folder structure. So basically the folder structure for this, I recommend structure A, which is detailed here, where basically you have a ROMs folder. Inside that ROMs folder, you have each platform: Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, PlayStation, PlayStation 2, whatever you need. And then adjacent to that ROMs folder, you have a BIOS folder. And inside that folder, you have your platform BIOS for PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2, Game Boy, yeah, da, 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 da. There is also structure B, which is a fallback structure, but I think it's backwards in my eyes, where you have Game Boy Advance, Game Boy Color, whatever, and then inside that you have ROMs and then BIOS. It's just, in my eyes, a lot of unnecessary duplication. And plus, with the devices I use, most of it's already organized this way anyway. You'll also need some recommended metadata providers. So obviously, it needs to pull the correct information from a data source or a metadata provider in this case. So the one I always recommend is Screen Scraper. This is one of the best scrapers out there. It's completely free. There is, if you donate to them, you do get access to more scrape requests and more threads. However, the free version, you do get a healthy amount. So, but I chucked them the €10, just a one-off donation, and I get up to 100,000 scrape requests a day, which sounds like a lot. I've never actually hit it, actually. But on top of that, you also get the extra threads, which means it can process the data faster rather than having a single thread, which can take all day. So Screen Scraper, I recommend. There is also Hashes, which I've not really used too much. There's IGDB, which I have used. SteamGridDB is a great one. You need an API key and a Steam account for that. I'll cover those shortly. Retro Achievements is the greatest thing to happen to retro gaming since emulation. So I fully advise getting a Retro Achievements account if that's something you're interested in. Basically, it allows you to unlock achievements in your favorite retro games. So for the quick start, it says there hashes. So you don't have to have an API key. It is quick, but it only matches by hash. So what that means is each file, you will have a unique identifier. So this is the hash for this file. As long as you have a matching hash on that side, on the hashes side, it will be able to go, right, it's this file, so I'm going to get this artwork, this box art, this description, whatever it might be. So if you just want something quick, go with hashes, although I fully recommend this combo at the top, the French connection, as they call it, Screen Scraper and Retro Achievements. Retro Achievements, again, completely free. We'll just need to get our API key. So once you set up those metadata providers, we're going to need a copy of the config YAML file inside the config folder. We'll also need to set up those folders, which I'll do shortly as well. So basically, this is the configuration. So if you're new to self-hosting, some self-hosting apps will let you edit the configuration from within the app itself. Some of them, they will load the configuration on load, and then it will just read whatever's in there. So it's always good just to go through and then really see what's happening. They're very nicely formatted. I do advise as well getting yourself a code editor. I recommend Visual Studio because these are just text files. You can open them in something like Notepad, but if you open them in a dedicated IDE or a code editor, you usually get proper formatting, you get color coding, and some autocomplete as well. So it can be just a little bit easy, especially for those of you who are new to this kind of thing. So that's what you're going to need for now. So to install ROM, we're going to need this Docker Compose file. So what this is Docker, when you're setting up a project, it will go through and it will basically, it's a list of instructions on what it needs to do. So if I just zoom in here, we can have a nice little look at what's in there. So I'll take you through what's in here. Some of this stuff, things like passwords and API keys, I won't be able to show you, obviously, but I will show you a censored version of my Docker file at the end of this section, and then you can kind of cross-compare with yours. I will be changing some stuff that's in here, but I'll detail that when we get to that point. So At the top, we have version 3. I believe this is quite redundant for a lot of newer Docker installations, so you can just leave that as is. Volumes, this is going to be the volumes that it creates. So when the container runs, it'll say, right, you've got to create these 3 folders. You've got your MySQL data, you've got your ROM resources, and then your ROM Redis data, which is also referenced in these volumes here as well. Services, so this is going to be the information that it's downloading. So the service is called ROM. The image is going to be a ROM app/ROM, and it's going to use the latest tag. So what this means is this is where it's going to download the image from. On GitHub and things like that, and the Docker store, you can tag releases. So some people might have a development branch, or they might have a slight variant. We're just going to leave it on latest and just get the most up to date. Usually the latest is the most staple version. There might be some development versions in that, but I wouldn't recommend. Container name, ROM, is just the name of the container. Restart unless stopped. So this basically means that if it ever crashes, it will automatically restart itself unless you manually stop it. If you manually stop it, it will stop. Most people who are into self-hosting, they just leave it on unless stopped. In my use cases, there's no real reason to have it on anything else. This environment section, we have what's called environment variables. So alongside this list of instructions, this is basically like a kind of Q&A in a way. It's going to say, right, ROM needs answers to these questions. You need to provide those answers. So some of them here, there are comments here that do detail. So that should match the MariaDB database in the MariaDB section that's down here. We'll get to that shortly. There's also our ROM auth secret key, which I'll show you. It tells you there how to generate it, but I'll show you that anyway. Screen scraper username, screen scraper password, obviously once you've set that account up. The retro achievements API key, I'll show you where to get that as well. SteamGrid DB API key, I'll show you where to get that. And the Hashius API enabled is true. So basically you can set that to false if you don't want to use Hashius. There's no harm in just leaving it on. Then we have our volumes. So we've got the ROM resources volume. So what these volumes do is the first part of the path is the link to the folder. And then the second part is the mount path. So that's basically how does the container refer to these file paths? Because basically we need to mount drives to these containers, which gives them access. So the good thing about Docker is it's a walled garden. And it's got a big bouncer on the gate. And if your name's not down, you're not coming in. So if you need to expose something to a Docker container, you need to make sure it's listed here. For example, if you don't put your ROM library path and you try and go in the app and find your ROM library, it's not going to see it. You can try anything, it will not find it. It's not even going to bother looking. So the ones at the top here that we've declared, the reason they don't have a path is because they are inside the container already. So our resources and our Redis data. The 3 we're concerned about is these ones here that say path to. So all we need to do is we're going to need to repopulate those with a link to our ROM library, our save files, and our config file. So this folder here, where it says path to config, the file I mentioned earlier, the configuration file, that's basically, this is asking you where have you put it. So you can have this anywhere as long as it's got the file in there, because that's what it's going to look at. For some reason, it says optional. However, if you try and open it without a config file, it won't work. So I don't know why it says optional, unless I'm missing something. Ports can be quite a complex one. So what this is saying is you have an internal port and an external port. So I don't want to get too down in the weeds about networking because it can be very, very overwhelming, especially for newcomers. But what this is saying is we're going to log, once we've booted the app, on our network, where are we going to find it? In which case, it will be port 80. And then also the external port. Don't worry too much about that for now. And then depends on basically says that in order for this part to load, we need to make sure that the RomDB service, which is below, which we'll go through shortly, is healthy and can restart. So now we've got the RomDB container here, which the layout is pretty much the same. The image is using MariaDB, which is a database image. That's going to be called RomDB. Restart unless stopped. And then the root password and the MariaDB password. So for the root password there, use a unique secure password. And then for the MariaDB password, it needs to match whatever you put in this DB password here. So they are all detailed in the comments. So do be sure to make sure that you've done everything as intended. And then the volume there, the MySQL data, which is declared at the top of the thing here, that's just how that's going to refer to it. You don't need to worry too much about that. And then it's going to do some health checks. So basically, you're going to start the container. It'll do some prerequisite checks just to make sure, are we good to go? Once that's happy, and it's going to tell this depends on function that, yep, we're good to go. So you can go ahead and boot the ROM service. If it tried to do it in order, what would happen is there'd be no database for ROM to access. So it'd just panic and crash, then the database would start, but by that point, it's too late. So that is just an overview of how a Docker Compose file works, and in this case, the ROM Docker Compose file. I'm going to go through, I'm going to fill this out, I'm going to talk about what I've done. I'm going to obviously obfuscate the passwords and things like that. And then once we've done that, we'll actually get to the fun part of installing ROM. So I've just completed my YAML file. So for Screen Scraper, you could just use your username and password as it says. For Retro Achievements, you sign in, you hover over your little profile picture, you come down to Settings, that'll take you to this screen. Then if you scroll down, I won't do it now because you'll see my key, you'll see a API key. You click that, there's a copy button, you copy that, you drop it straight in that YAML file. And for SteamGrid DB, you sign in with your Steam profile, you come over here, top right to your name, go to Preferences, and then these tabs here, you just click API and it'll give you the API key. And you just copy that into the YAML file itself. So I've already done that here. So what I want to draw your attention to is obviously I've completed all the passwords and API keys that it's asked for, but here is what I want to draw attention to. So where my folders are. So I've got my volume 2, which is my main media drive on my NAS. That has a emulation folder, which I'm going to use as my whole ROM library folder. So it's got access to my ROMs, to my BIOS files, all that good stuff. The saves also exists inside that folder, but I've declared it as its own saves file, so ROM knows to put them or to use that as its internal assets folder. And for the config file, I've put a path here, volume 1 Docker, which is where I keep, it's an SSD cache inside my server. Basically, that's where I run all my apps from. And then they point at the volume 2 to get all the relevant media. Inside that, I have a ROM folder, and then inside that, I have a config folder. Now, one thing to note with Docker Compose files or Docker, it cannot mount a folder that doesn't exist. It won't automatically create one. Okay, here we are. So I've headed over to my server, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my shared folder. This is where my volumes are kept. I'm going to go to my Docker folder. Now, as you can see, I don't yet have a ROM folder, so I'm going to make one. So I'll create a folder, call it ROM, and then inside that, I'll create one that's called config. So this will allow it, this will be where I put that file, so it knows exactly where that file is. So now that's all been ready to set up, we just need to set up one final thing, and that's this configuration file. So if you click configuration file on the side, it'll detail you what you need to fill out. So I'm going to go to config example.yaml. We're going to download the raw file, and then I'm going to open it up. So it's always good, and this is why it's good to have an IDE or a code editor of some type, just so it's much easier to see this. So you can see by default everything is commented out, which obviously is what we don't want. So we're going to need to just edit a few things. So you can exclude specific platforms if you want to. I don't need to. You can exclude ROMs or parts of ROMs to be scanned. So I'm going to enable this because you might find that if you're like me and you use front ends on your Android devices, or you use things like Launchbox, or even if you're on a Mac, for example, what they can do is they can create junk files, and it's very annoying. So all I've done there is the config will only read what it is uncommented. So if you're not familiar with code, pop in a hash in this case, as if it varies for languages, is called a comment. What this does is it means that the compiler or the Docker, the app itself that's reading the config, it will just ignore it. It will treat it as though it's not there. So all I did was I uncommented and I just deleted the comments off the front of these lines, and you can see we've got that lovely green. So we're going to ignore or exclude all ROMs that contain here XML or text. And what you can do, you can add here, so if there's RAR or not Raspberry, if there's RAR or if there's is it DB? It's like a thumbs.db. So any extensions you want to ignore, you can just add as many lines as you want. I'm just going to leave those for now. I might come back and tweak it once I do the setup, but just as a starting point, we'll use that. There's also a Unix name matching pattern there, which does essentially the same thing, but it looks at the file names rather than just the extensions, which I don't think I'll need to do at this point. But again, we can always come back and tweak it later. Multi-files game selections. So that looks like if you will apply to files that are in subfolders. Oh, so I don't really have subfolders, so that's not relevant to me. But if you have specific collections and subfolders, then this is where you'd apply that. And again, you can exclude stuff from there. Now, system, this one can get a little bit confusing. So I use the ESDE, the emulation station folder layout. Some of the names of that can be a little bit odd. So I will just remove all the comments off the front of that. So basically what it's saying is if I have a GC folder or GameCube, ROM will treat it as NGC, and that's how it will refer to it. So it knows to map it to Nintendo GameCube. And the same for PS1 and PSX. Now, my PS1 folder is PSX, so I'm just going to change that. I also think my N3DS folder is 3DS, and my NDS folder is DS. File system, custom games folder names only. So my ROMs folder. My ROMs folder is called ROMs, but it's a capital. I don't know if that's strict, but I'm going to change it anyway. Some of them can be case sensitive. Skip file hash calculations. I'm not going to do that now. For scanning. So the way ROM works, you can manually upload all your ROMs, drag and drop however you want, or you can do what I'm going to do and you can just have it scan. So you point it at your ROMs folder and it works its way through. So we need to enable that. We also need to make sure that we set things correctly. So here what I'm doing is, so Flashpoint I'm not using. How long to beat I'm not using. Artworks we'll use. Actually, I don't have IGDB, so I won't use that one. And the same for that one. So basically, if you want to exclude something, you can just comment it out. I'm also not... Oh, I know I've got the games list folder. That's fine. Regions. So we'll enable all the regions because some of my ROMs have different regions. For language, we only want English. For media assets, need to uncomment language and region. Alternative cover art. So use box art for that. So these are just choices, so you can just uncomment them as you wish. Manual in PDF format. Yeah, well, manual. Well, these seem to be alternates. So what's added to the screenshots carousel? The screenshots. Do the bezel. You do gameplay videos if you want. However, they are they can be quite heavy on the system, so I'm not going to be doing that. Battle games list, using that. And a marquee, I like a marquee. Auto export metadata files after scan completes. Don't really need to worry about that. Emulator JS per core options. So we'll worry about the emulator stuff later. And there we are. So I don't tend to use this much as a web emulator. I use it more just as an accessible library. So now that config is there, what I'm going to do is in my downloads folder. So I'm going to rename it to config. I'm going to take out what it says example and just have config.yml, config.yaml. Because if I don't, it, as was featured in my Docker Compose, it won't be able to see the file. It has to be called config.yaml. So now that's in there, I'm going to open up that config file and I'm just going to drag and drop. So obviously, if you've made a folder for ROM, just make sure that you're referencing the right folders and the right file paths. Normally, it is quite good at telling you. So if you try and build a container and one of the paths isn't mounted correctly, it will tell you. It'll say, oh, it's this one, I can't find this. So it normally does guide you in the right direction. So now that's all set up, we need to actually install ROM. So we'll boot over to Docker. I'm going to create a project. The project will be called ROM. The storage path. So this is just the storage path for this particular YAML file. So what I always like to make a folder inside my app folder called Docker Compose, just for neatness, just so if I ever need to find it again, I can. So we'll confirm that. Now, all I'm going to do, and obviously because there's sensitive information in my actual YAML file, is I'm going to copy and paste everything over to the project, and then I'm going to hit deploy, just down here. So I will skip to the bit where it's deploying. So we can see here, I've just zoomed right in. It's currently downloading the images, and then once the images are downloaded, it'll start booting them. You'll normally get a little confirmation message, just say, I think it's error code 0 or exit code 0, where it basically means it's all good to go. And then once that's done, we'll boot into ROM. So I've been able to successfully deploy ROM. However, I did have a few issues which I had to resolve. So firstly, I have a app already running on port 80. So I wasn't able to use port 80. So the reason we have two ports here, one of them is the port on my system, in this case port 80, and then one is the internal port for the container, 8080. So I changed this to 1992 and it worked fine. I also did have an issue with the config file, as some of my indentation was off, so I did have to go back and tidy that up a little bit. So if you do get any errors, it will usually point you in the right direction. So without further ado, let me zoom out. And then what you're going to want to do now is you want to go to the IP address of whatever device is that you're hosting on. So for example, it's usually like 192.168. If you're hosting it on your Windows machine, you can just go to you can type in localhost : and then the port number. It might be 80 for you. In this case, it's 1992, like I mentioned earlier. So as I'm not on my device is a server, it's a separate device, the address is slightly different. So it's 192.168.1.58 : so this is where we're going to put our port in. So 1992. There we go. So ROM is loading up. So this is going to be our first boot. So it's detected some platforms. It's got GameCube. So obviously GameCube's formatted a little bit differently. It's got my PlayStation games there. It's got loads of Nintendo ones. That all looks good. And then these are just the other platforms it supports, which I don't have, so not too concerned about them. So we're going to need to do a username, email, and password. So when you access ROM, once you've set this up, you will have to log in, obviously for security reasons. So when it comes to exposing ROM to the internet, you obviously don't want everyone to be able to access it. So just as an added layer of security, then you can set a username and password. So I'm just going to set RetroPup as my username, and I'm going to pop in my RetroPup email, and then I will set a password, and then I'll see you soon. So now that password's set, you can see here, this is what it's been able to log into. So I didn't use an API key for the IGDB or Moby Games. I've got Screen Scraper, I've got Retro Achievements, I've got Hashius. I didn't add Launchbox. I disabled Flashpoint, and I didn't want How Long to Beat, but I have got Steam Grid DB. Obviously, if you want those, then it's all in that config file. This is just what it's been able to successfully log into. So you could just leave it on Hashius if you wanted, but I wouldn't recommend it. So now we're going to click Finish. So it's asking me if I want to save that password. Just for ease of this, I'm going to say yes, and then I'm going to log in to ROM. And there we are. I've got no games. So all I'm going to do now is run a quick scan. So there are a few different types of scans, and it can be a little bit confusing. So I'm going to go over to the scan section, and then I'm going to go to our metadata sources. So I'm just going to take Screen Scraper and Retro Achievements. And it's going to, for each game, it's going to scan both of those sources. What I tend to do is I use those as my primary ones. Obviously, Retro Achievements I always have enabled. Screen Scraper, my primary. It might not be able to get everything. There are no scrapers out there that have absolutely everything. So I start with this, and then I might do another pass with Hashius. I might do another pass with Steam Grid DB if there's a few missing box arts. It all depends on the results. So I'm going to come over here and go to make sure it's set to quick scan. If you want to do a complete rescan, you can, but it takes ages. Quick scan will scan things that aren't yet in this database. So I'm just going to hit scan. And then we should see what will happen. This can take a while. I have got a lot of games. I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head. 7,000 maybe? A lot of them old retro games. So even though the file sizes aren't too big, the images still have to be scraped. The Retro Achievements database still has to be scraped. So it can take a bit of time. So what I'll do is I will come back once it's all done, and then we'll have a quick look at it. And then, so you can see there, it's not been able to identify the GameCube folder. I suspect that this might be because of the file format I use, which is okay. So I'm hoping, however, that when it scans the other folders, we should see more games. There we go. I've got 6,296 games that it has found. So I will come back once it's done some scanning, and then we'll have a look. Okay, so it's been a few days of scanning. So I thought what I'd do just before I kind of go through the specifics of the features of ROM and things like that, I'd just show you the things I had to tweak in my Docker Compose file. So if we just zoom ourselves in. So firstly, I found that the scanner seemed to automatically time out after, I think, 4 hours is the default. That's by design. It didn't bug out or anything. Unfortunately, that means it was scanning for 4 hours, and then it just stopped, regardless of where it's up to. And then when you run another scan, it would do a few more games, but it still has to spend a good amount of time doing that scan to catch up. So what I did was, they're called environment variables. These are variables here. They are all listed on the ROM website, which I'll show you shortly. So I changed that. It's in seconds. So I changed that from 4 hours to, I think that's 12, 43,200, just so it had enough time to scan all the games, grab all the metadata. I also found that I was originally just using Retro Achievements and Screen Scraper, and it seemed to do a lot of systems, but not all of them. So I added the IGDB client, which is you need a Twitch login for. All the setup for that is detailed on the ROM website. And I also enabled the Launchbox API, which you don't need a login for, but you do need to declare these variables. So we've got Launchbox API enabled is true. We need to turn it on. Enable scheduled update Launchbox metadata equals true. So that basically downloads a version of the Launchbox metadata. And then we've got this little cron feature here, which is like a time feature. So I'm trying to remember my cron function properly. So basically, every day at 5 a.m. I think that's every day at 5 a.m. It will update it. You can just Google or use AI to give you a good cron function, but just use this one; it'll be fine. So that's all the changes that I did to my Docker Compose. So we'll get rid of that. So now let's actually go back into ROM. So I'm gonna go to my IP and my port, which I've put at 1992. And here we go. So this is ROM with all the metadata and collections that are auto-generated. I believe these are part of Hashes, maybe, or possibly one of the other metadata scrapers. So you can have custom collections, but it does automatically create these as it scans. So they're kind of handy. Now, one of the features we also have um, of ROM is it actually has a web player built into it, which runs off a modified version of RetroArch. So if we go over to our Game Boy games and we click this little, oh, no, we don't. We click play. It'll take us to a play screen, so we can load saves, we can load states if there's any available, we can toggle full screen on and off, and then we can click play. Now, if there's multiple cores, you do also have an option to play with cores. Now, I don't tend to use this too much, so I won't spend too much on it, but you can just use your arrow keys, and then I think it's Z and X is your A and B. So it's a nice little gimmick. My main usage for ROM is managing my ROMs and also being able to download them directly to devices, which I'll show you later. A lovely 8-bit remix of the Bond theme. So we're just going to quit out of that. So we can play up to, I think, PS1 games remotely. Anything stronger, you can't, unfortunately. But I can imagine most people would rather play things like that on a dedicated device rather than over a web browser. So there's also, it's worth mentioning, I won't be demonstrating it in this video, it also has a built-in ROM patcher. So if you're into ROM hacks, like the Pokemon ROM hacks, or I think there's a few Zelda ones, things like that, it has a built-in ROM patcher, which is Patcher.js, which is the one that a lot of people use on their own website. But it's all built in. So what you can do is you can get your ROM file, you can get your patch file, that's all the supported ones there. And then not only can you download the patched ROM, so you've got a copy of it, you can pop onto a device, you can also automatically upload it straight into your ROM library. So you don't have to download it, then upload it. It's all automatic. So that's quite a handy little feature, especially if you're someone who's into ROM hacks. So just a few things about the UI. So if we click this little ROM icon at the top, that'll take us back to this home screen. You can see there I've also got to continue playing. So anything you do play through the browser will populate there as well. So we have our platforms where we can browse. You've also got that here. If you click these buttons, you can change how many display, the layout. Very basic, that kind of thing. But if you go into platforms and then pick a platform, in here, you can select the console icon, you can rename it, you can upload ROMs here, you can force a scan just for this platform, you can change the box art dimensions, although unfortunately it's not responsive in terms of the box art it has. So I tried this with PS1 having these square box arts, and it just cropped the ones it had. It didn't try and resize them. But like I said, I don't tend to use this much for that kind of thing. It's more of like a simple management tool. So you also have firmwares that you can upload. I don't really know what these are for. I believe they're related to the emulator side that you can also download, because it does say it's for the BIOS, but I don't really know where that would come into use here. I'm sure it's covered in the documentation. We also have a filter gallery, so you can show things like duplicates. So I don't know if I have any duplicates. It says I've got a couple there, so I can decide what I want to do with those. Oh yeah, I can see I've got a US and European one there. So I can basically clear out duplicates. You can also filter, if you use the retro achievement scraper, you can filter games with retro achievements, games without retro achievements. It's just a enable, disable toggle. There's all sorts in here: genres, franchises, collections, statuses. I don't know what match status would be. I think, oh, you search for a status in there. I think you can mark games as in progress. You can go to edit. You can edit metadata manually. So if you want to pull some box art, you can do so just from here, provided you've logged into some metadata scrapers. And then also there's different ones here if the game's named part of a series. You can see there the actual metadata that it's pulled from the scrapers. So pretty cool. So the main thing I want to talk about next, and it's trying to find a way to do this, but because it involves a lot of things like passwords and IP addresses, I can't show too much for fear of exposing my own. So ROM is best served when you set up a reverse proxy. If you're not sure what a reverse proxy is, basically it's so a proxy server is a link that goes through another link. A reverse proxy is the same thing but in reverse. So if, for example, I have a proxy server which connects to my hard drive, so rather than type in a manual IP address, which might change, I just type in a domain name, which is like a web address, and it automatically redirects me. So for that, I use Cloudflare and their Cloudflare tunneling, which the tunneling part is free, but you need to purchase a domain name, which I thoroughly recommend you do. I was able to get a decent one that I can use for many things for about $5 a year, I think it was, or $6 a year. So check that out. Again, it's quite hard to, it's not something I can really show, but there are guides in there how to set up tunneling. And then I also use Nginx Proxy Manager, which I host on my server. If you go to, oh, I was already on it. You go to the ROM documentation, and then we go to getting started. There is a reverse proxy guide here. So there's all sorts of different ones. So you've got Caddy and TLS. I haven't used either of those. You've got the Nginx. I do use Nginx, but I don't use this version. I use the proxy manager version, which is more kind of GUI focused. And then you need things like SSL certificates, and a lot of those do come with, you can get them free from a place called Let's Encrypt. There's also Trafic, which I believe is quite a popular one, which I haven't used. You can run this off your own server. So you can see there, you basically tell it what your IP address is or your local IP, and it will just redirect traffic to that port. So whichever your preference is, then by all means, do what works for you. Again, it's something I would cover in this guide, but it's quite complex, and because it involves a lot of potential security risks, I've already had videos where I've accidentally leaked my own passwords and had to change them, so I don't want to risk actually exposing my entire server. Always work smarter. So everything is detailed here. There's also a list of the supported platforms. So when I was setting up the configuration file, there is this list here. So this is the short name. So for example, Dreamcast is DC. So my original Dreamcast folder, I think, was just called Dreamcast. So you'd have to remap that. And then also the compatible scrapers. So check out the documentation. It's very thorough. It is quite handy. There's also these web players here. So this just explains how they work. They do have a net play, but it does say it's currently not working. So I won't worry too much about that. And if you have custom platforms, there's also how to set those up inside ROM. For me, I don't really need them because mine are all covered. There's also setups for different systems. So like I said, I'm using a Ugreen NAS, but if you've got a Synology, which I used to have, or an Unraid server, then you can do so. So obviously I mentioned briefly at the start of the video that you can do this through a Windows installation, which is a good way to introduce yourself to self-hosting, but it's designed, the self-hosting servers are designed to be always on. So if you don't care about the planning and you want to leave your PC on all the time, however, I would not recommend it. So now that's sorted, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my AYN Thor, and we're going to set up an app called Argosy Launcher. So this is available on Obtainium, on the RJMY emulation pack. And what this is a way that I can connect to my ROM instance and then just download games straight to my AYN Thor without having to use FTP or plug into USB or take an SD card and pop it into an SD card reader. And because of the nature of doing this through a reverse proxy, I can also do this when I'm at work, or if I'm at a family or friend's house and I want to, or if I'm traveling and I've got Wi-Fi, or I'm hotspotting off my phone, I'll be able to download a game on the go. So if you're someone who wants to only keep select games on the device and swap them out, then this is ideal. So let's have a look at our Argosy Launcher. Okay, here we are. So there is a couple of apps that we can use that integrate with ROM. So the first I'll mention is our Argosy Launcher, like I mentioned earlier. So this is more of a kind of front end Argosy Launcher. So if I go to Obtainium, have I got it installed on here? I do not, so we'll install that. We'll just use the normal 1.0 version. I don't know why it's giving me rate limit errors, but let's just click on the link and download it manually. There we are, 1.0. And then we'll go to my file explorer, and the first app I'm going to install is Argosy. I've also downloaded RShop by Average Consumer, and I'll leave links to both of these in the description. I'll install them both now, and then we'll just cover them. So Argosy acts as more of a kind of front end style. So we'll boot it up. It's going to ask us to get started. So you can see here it's asking for us for our server URL and also an API token. So we're going to need to create an API token within ROM itself in order to get access. So if you've set up a reverse proxy, you put in your proxy URL. If you're just on your local network, then you can put in your IP address of your machine and then your port number 192.168 and then port 80, or if you had to change it like I did, whatever the relevant port you changed it to. So I am going to just enter my credentials. Before I do that, I will show you how to generate a API key. So inside ROM, if we go to the little profile picture on the bottom left, client API tokens, and we're just going to click create. And then you can give your token a name. So I'm just going to call this Odin. I'm on the Odin 3. And then expiration, you can set 30 days, 90 days, a year, or never. I'd normally not recommend doing never, just in case. So I'm just going to do 90 days. I think that's fair. And then you can set permissions and disable permissions as you see fit. However, for the purposes of this, I'm just going to leave them all ticked. So when I click pair device, it's going to show me that API key, and then I'm going to be able to connect. So I'm just going to go and fill that out, and then I'll be back shortly. Okay, so the ROM side has confirmed that it's been paired correctly. Just going to boot up my screen capture software again. So now I'm just going to go through, and like I normally do with front ends, we're just going to grant the necessary permissions that it needs. Once they're all done, we'll just hit continue. So now I'm going to choose a game folder. So I do have a ROMs path, but I've only actually got one game installed on here. So I'm just going to click into my ROMs folder and press my X button. There we go. For image cache location, so by default, game artwork is stored in the app's internal cache. I'm just going to leave it on internal because for the most part, I won't actually be using this as a front end. I'll be using it just to kind of download games. So you can set up syncs where I believe it will get games for you. So if I say, for example, I go to Game Boy Advance and I click continue, you can download emulator cores and do it that way, and we can start playing. So sync your library from your ROM manager. So there we go. So it's syncing the library. Okay, so it does do that quite quick, and then it's grabbed some of the artwork all off my server, and then we can go through and I can say, all right, I want to get Super Mario Brothers 3. You can see there it's got a retro achievements counter. Don't know what the 89% is, possibly a rating, although they all seem to be 89%. Not too sure about that one. So we can just click and move my fat head out of the way. You can see there's some buttons down here. So I'm just going to tap my A button and we're going to download it. So that was very quick. So if I just come out of this and I go to my file explorer and I go to my ROMs folder, should see in my Game Boy Advance folder, There we go. Super Mario Brothers 3, just in there. So you can choose this as a game downloader. I believe you can also play it straight from. There we go. So this is using the Game Boy player. So this runs all inside Argosy Launcher. So I've never actually played it through Argosy, so I don't know how reliable it's going to be. But it's booted and it works. So in terms of controls, I think they should just be mapped natively. Although I don't have any sound. I think I might have muted this. Probably for good reason. So yeah. So that's very handy. Obviously, if you have preferred front ends, so for example, I really like Emulation Station. If I flip over to Emulation Station now, because it's in my ROMs folder, you can see that it's picked up Super Mario Advance 4. So unfortunately, I don't have the metadata because that metadata from Argosy was stored internally. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at our shop, which, whereas Argosy kind of serves as both a player and a downloader, our shop, from my experience, seems to be strictly just a player. So we can, not only can you pair ROM, or if you're using an older version of ROM, you can enter the username and password. You can also add your own server. So for example, if you just had some folders of ROMs on your PC or on a network drive somewhere, or even hosted on a website, for example, you can just map them that way, add in the server, or you can just point to some local games. I don't really know why you'd want local games, but okay, there's probably a reason for it. So I'm just going to use ROM again. So I'm going to open this up, and then it's not specifically told me, but what this is actually wants is where are my ROMs stored. So I'm just going to use my ROMs folder there. And then it's asking me to use the camera that this device doesn't have to enter or to scan the QR code for the API key for ROM. So unfortunately, I can't do that. So I'm going to have to enter the code manually. So what I'll do, just as I did a moment ago for Argosy, is I'm going to enter in the server URL and my pairing code. I'm going to make a new API key because I always advise that for things like this, don't use the same API key across multiple different apps, just in case. Just a little bit of added security because you never know who's watching. So I will see you momentarily. Okay, so I have logged in successfully. It was all very easy, just the exact same as I did with Argosy Launcher. You can export this config if you want to just import it across other devices if you want to save a bit of time, or it's nice to have a backup in case you need to factory reset your device. You can log into Retro Achievements and track your games that way. I won't be doing that because I always track them through Retro Achievements directly. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump in and we're going to let the home screen sync. So if you can see in the top right corner there, we've just got the devices syncing. So it's going to race through them. You can see there, if I go to all games, the little cloud number just popping up there. So we'll just give that a moment. Shouldn't take too long to just display all the games that I've already got within ROM. So with these, it's not going to be saving or caching the images like it would with Argosy. It's just getting them straight from the cloud. So I must have a lot of DS games, so I probably need to go through and clear some of those out. So there we are. So I can browse by all, and you can see there's a little system abbreviation on the top left there. I can go by a system. So what I'll do is we'll get an NES game, and then we'll go for something random. We'll just get The Adventures of Lolo. So we get here, we've got the metadata that was been scraped on ROM, which is all very handy. You can see the description. You can favorite the game if you want to kind of manage your library this way. These share buttons and looks like a bookshelf, that collection button. They seem to be grayed out. I'm not too sure why that is. But we can just hit download. We'll just allow that. Yeah, we'll ask you some permissions the first time. And then that seems to have already downloaded. As I'd hope, it's only 36 kilobytes. So now if I go back to, we'll exit out of that. If I go to my ROMs folder and I go to NES, there it is, Adventures of Lolo. So I can then play that on my emulator of choice, which would be RetroArch. So there we are. That was again a simple-ish guide on how to set up and utilize ROM. You can also use it. There is an app called Grout, which is available on certain, I think it's again Ambinic devices and possibly some other custom firmwares. There is also I think in Mu OS, Mustard OS, for Ambinic devices as well. There is also I don't know if it's built in or it's an additional app you can get where you can get a copy of ROM, and it works exactly the same. It just allows you to download the games directly to the system. So hopefully this video helped you out. I apologize for not being able to go more in depth when it comes to the reverse proxy stuff. However, that is quite advanced and there are a lot of security implications. However, there are fully detailed guides out there. My personal recommendation, if you're using a server or an old PC to run this kind of thing off, then I found the easiest way was to go through Cloudflare, buy a domain name for a few quid a year, and then follow a guide on how to set up the tunnel. You connect the tunnel to a instance of Nginx Proxy Manager, and you can just manage it that way. It's very, very simple. It's very secure, which we want. But unfortunately, apologies again for not being able to directly show you that part. But if this video did help you out, I would appreciate a like and a subscribe. Tell your friends, and I will see you next time.